Throughout the dark winter nights of November and December 1803, residents of Hammersmith to the west of London began reporting terrifying encounters with a ghostly apparition that was haunting the local lanes, fields and churchyards. The Morning Post informed its readers that this ghost has hitherto appeared every evening in the churchyard about a half-mile from the town, adjoining to which is a public road. Some witnesses described the spectre as being dressed in a white sheet, whilst others reported that it wore the skin of a beast, a calf skin or something of that sort. Irrespective of its attire, the majority of those who had seen it were unanimous about one thing: the experience had been absolutely terrifying. The ghost has for upwards of 2 months excited so much alarm that every superstitious person in that neighbourhood has been filled with the most fearful apprehensions, the Morning Post continued. So terror-struck are the minds of the women and children that not one will venture over the threshold after 5 o'clock in the evening. Thomas Groom, a drayman to Hammersmith brewer Mr. Burgess, encountered it whilst walking through St. Paul's churchyard with a fellow servant between 8 and 9 o'clock at night on the 15th of December 1803. He later gave a vivid account of his experience. "I had my jacket under my arm and my hands in my pocket when some person came from behind a tombstone behind me and caught me fast by the throat with both hands and held me fast. My fellow servant, who was going on before, hearing me scuffling, asked what the matter was. Then, whatever it was, gave me a twist round, and I saw nothing. I gave a bit of a push out with my fist and felt something soft, like a greatcoat." The fright, so the Morning Post reported, together with the ill usage, threw the poor fellow into a fever from which he has but very lately recovered. The terror of the phantom operating upon the superstition of an elderly woman, the Scots Magazine informed its readers, brought on a dejection of mind from which she never recovered. William Girdler, the private watchman appointed by the inhabitants of Hammersmith to patrol the area by night, saw the ghost near the 4 Mile Stone on Black Lion Lane on Thursday the 29th of December. "I was doing my rounds about 10 o'clock at night when I saw a tall, whitish figure, which on approaching nearer I found had a sheet or tablecloth over its head. As I approached, he threw up his hands and turned back the sheet, and I clearly saw that the person had on a dark coat with metal buttons. The person ran off. I gave chase, but lost him in the darkness." 2 days later, on Saturday the 31st of December, Thomas Milwood, a 22-year-old bricklayer, was walking home along Hammersmith Terrace. He was wearing his usual work attire of white canvas trousers, which came down to the edge of his shoes, a white flannel waistcoat, a white shirt, and a white apron. 2 ladies and a man who were coming along the terrace in a carriage were alarmed by the sight of him. "There goes the ghost!" the man called out as they passed him. "I am no more of a ghost than you are," snapped Milwood, adding, "Do you want a punch of the head?" Arriving home, he told his mother-in-law, Phoebe Fulbrook, with whom he and his wife resided, what had occurred. Phoebe was worried for his safety. "Thomas, says I," she later related, "as there is a piece of work about the ghost, and your clothes look white, pray do put on your greatcoat that you may not run any danger." He said he wished the ghost was catched, or something of that sort. The ghostly sightings continued into the new year. The Morning Post on Friday the 6th of January published details of several of these sightings. He was seen on Monday evening last pursuing a young woman who shrieked dreadfully. Although there were 4 male passengers in the stagecoach which passed at the time, not one durst venture to the rescue of the distressed female. We have a very melancholy circumstance to add. The wife of a labourer in the town, far advanced in a state of pregnancy, saw this ghost, and her fright is so great that her life is despaired of. One night, a driver of a coach was proceeding down one of the remote lanes in the neighbourhood when he was alarmed by an uncommon rustling noise. By a faint light from the moon, he saw a strange creature, dressed all in white, gliding over the adjoining meadow towards him. As the phantom drew close, he saw bladders attached to its head, shoulders, arms, feet and body. So terrified was he that he jumped from the coach and ran back to the town to raise the alarm. About a dozen stout fellows proceeded with him to the spot where the coach and horses had been left. They found the traces cut and the horses grazing in an adjoining field. Such was the state of alarm in the district that a clergyman and a gentleman offered a reward of 5 guineas to anyone who could capture the Hammersmith Ghost. Over the first 3 days of January 1804, groups of young men armed with rifles and pistols began roaming the lanes and fields of the district by night, determined to lay the troublesome spectre once and for all. Amongst them was a 29-year-old excise officer by the name of Francis Smith, a lodger in the house of Mr. Oakley, adjoining the White Hart Tavern. He was, according to all who knew him, a very good-tempered young man, and nothing like a man of a cruel disposition. On the night of Tuesday the 3rd of January, Smith armed himself with a fowling piece and headed out to hunt for the spectre. At around 10:30 p.m, the watchman, William Girdler, met him at the corner of Black Lion Lane. Smith told him that he was going to search after the ghost. "I said I would come round after I had cried the hour and search the lanes, and we would take him if possible," Girdler later recounted. It was a very dark night, and Black Lion Lane, enclosed as it was on both sides by tall hedges, was particularly gloomy. According to Girdler, given that the visibility was so poor, they decided it would be wise to have a password, in order not to mistake each other for the ghost should they meet in the lane later. "We agreed to say, 'Who comes there?' 'Friend.' 'Advance, friend.'" Having agreed this password, Girdler continued on his round, and Smith plunged into the darkness of Black Lion Lane, which was a known haunt of the dreaded wraith. At around the same time, Thomas Milwood, dressed in his usual white work clothes, arrived at his parents' house on Black Lion Lane. His wife was ironing at the house of Mr. Smith, the outrider, and Thomas told his sister, Anne, that his wife would not be finished for another 30 or so minutes. Thomas, Anne, and their mother sat chatting by the fireside. "We talked a considerable time," Anne later recalled, "till my mother fell asleep while my brother was sitting. I heard the watchman crying past 11 o'clock. I told my brother, 'Your time has expired, you had better go.' He did not attend to me, but sat for a considerable time. I said, 'You had better go, it is dangerous for your wife to come home by herself.' He jumped up and said, 'I will go.' He bid my mother and me good night and went out of the door and shut it." No sooner had he gone than Anne was overcome by a feeling of dreadful foreboding. "I jumped up," she later testified, "and went to the door. As soon as I got to the door, I heard a voice say, 'Damn you! Who are you? And what are you? Damn you! I will shoot you!' And whilst they were speaking, a gun went off, and I saw the flash of fire from the gun. I went from the door and called, 'Thomas!' as loud as I could, 3 or 4 times, but nobody answered. I ran out to the door, and when I had got halfway from my father's house to my brother's, I saw my brother laying dead at the gate. I took hold of his right hand and said, 'Speak to me,' but he could not, for he was quite dead. His head was laying towards me. His face was bloody and entirely black." Realizing there was little she could do for him, Anne hurried home to raise the alarm. As Anne crouched over her brother's lifeless body, William Girdler, the watchman, was talking with Mr. Honour, the landlord, at the White Hart Tavern. Francis Smith came up to them in an agitated state. "He said he had hurt the man," Girdler later testified. "I said, 'I hope you have not hurt him much.' Says he, 'I have, and I fear very bad.'" The two hurried towards Black Lion Lane, where they met John Locke, a local wine merchant, and a Mr. George Stowe at the corner. The group made their way along the dark thoroughfare, where, at its junction with Beaver Lane, they saw the body of Thomas Milwood. He was quite dead, with a bullet wound on the left side of his lower jaw. The bullet had evidently been fired from close range, as the victim's face was exceedingly black from the gunpowder. As they looked down at the lifeless form, Francis Smith stammered that it had been very dark and he had seen the figure approaching. He had called out twice, but receiving no reply, had fired at it when it was almost upon him. He asked them to take him into custody immediately, but John Locke told him to go to his lodgings and wait there. Smith duly headed home. The men then carried Thomas Milwood's body to the Black Lion Inn. A parish constable by the name of Brooks then went to Francis Smith's lodgings and knocked on the door. "He looked out of the window and then came down immediately and surrendered himself," Brooks later testified. "I had him 2 days and nights in my custody." The next morning, Dr. Flower, the local medic, arrived at the Black Lion to examine the body. He later reported that the face was black. It had a gunshot wound on the left side of the lower jaw with small shot, about the size number 4, one of which had penetrated the vertebrae of the neck and injured the spinal marrow, which has communication to the brain. I examined the brain, but there was no injury whatsoever to the brain itself. There was no doubt, he said, that the gunshot was the cause of death. The inquest into the death of Thomas Milwood was held at the Black Lion Inn on Friday the 6th of January, with George Hodgson, the coroner for the county, presiding. The jury, so the General Evening Post reported the next day, was composed of the most respectable persons in the neighbourhood. All those who had witnessed the lead-up to and the aftermath of the tragedy were then called to give evidence. Phoebe Fulbrook, the mother-in-law of the deceased, made a poignant revelation when she testified that on the night of her son-in-law's death she had sent word to the family where her daughter was working that they were not on any account to let her come home, for she was sure it would be the death of her, as she was in a state of pregnancy. Having heard all the evidence, the coroner began his summing up by telling the jury that he regretted in this enlightened age that the fatal event which had convened them should have exhibited such a proof of the superstition of the uninformed part of the community. It was necessary, he said, to have it distinctly understood that no idea of a ghost justified any person to arm himself with a weapon of death for the purpose of destroying the supposed apparition. There was no pretence for saying that the deceased was either armed or that he had given any provocation. There was no doubt that Francis Smith had destroyed the life of the deceased. That he was not justified in doing so was clear. The jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against Francis Smith, and the coroner committed him to jail to take his trial at the next session at the Old Bailey. Francis Smith's trial for the murder of Thomas Milwood was held at the Old Bailey on Friday the 13th of January before the Lord Chief Baron, Sir Archibald MacDonald, Mr. Justice Rooke and Mr. Justice Lawrence. According to the Newgate calendar, the prisoner, who was dressed in a suit of black clothes, was a short but well-made man with dark hair and eyebrows, and the pallid hue of his countenance during the whole trial, together with the signs of contrition which he exhibited, commanded the sympathy of every spectator. Evidence was given by John Locke, William Girdler, Anne Milwood, Phoebe Fulbrook, Dr. Flower, and Brooks the constable. In addition, Thomas Groom was called to give evidence pertaining to his encounter with the ghost in the churchyard on the 15th of December, 1803. Speaking in his own defence, Francis Smith told the court that on the day when the fatal catastrophe had occurred, he went out with a good intention, and at the very moment of the affair taking place, he did not know what he was doing. He spoke to the person twice, and was so much agitated on receiving no answer that, in his confusion and dread, he was unfortunate enough to commit the rash action. But he solemnly declared to God that he had no malice against the deceased, nor any intention of taking away the life of any individual whatever. With the evidence completed, the Lord Chief Baron, Sir Archibald MacDonald, then began his summing up, and it quickly became apparent that he was not in the least bit impressed by Francis Smith's assurance that he had acted with the best of intentions. MacDonald told the jury that if a man intends to shoot at one person, and instead of doing so he kills another, against whom he might be able to prove that he entertains no malice or spite, he is, nevertheless, guilty of murder. He pointed out that Francis Smith's intention had not been to apprehend the ghost, which would have been the right thing to do, but rather to shoot him, erroneously imagining he was entitled to do so. In the eyes of the law, he had quite simply murdered Thomas Milwood. After deliberating for almost 2 hours, the jury found Smith guilty of manslaughter. The 3 judges said that they could not accept such a verdict. It must, they agreed, be either a verdict of murder or an acquittal. The jury, after reconsidering their verdict, then found him guilty of murder. The recorder sentenced him to be hanged on the following Monday. However, a stay of execution was issued, and on Tuesday the 24th of January, Francis Smith was pardoned by the king, on condition he serve 1 year in prison. By the time of Smith's trial, the publicity generated by the death of Thomas Milwood had led to the discovery of at least one of the culprits responsible for the hauntings. On the evening of Thursday the 5th of January, information was lodged with the local magistrate, Mr. Hill, which identified the ghost as a Hammersmith boot and shoemaker by the name of John Graham. Graham, so the newspapers reported, had a wife and 3 children, was very religiously inclined, and was a constant attendant at chapel, where he was one of the principal singers. In other words, he was the last person his friends, neighbours and family would have expected to be roaming the dark lanes of Hammersmith with a sheet over his head. Questioned by the magistrate as to his reason for assuming the appearance of a ghost, Graham said that he had done it in order to be revenged upon his apprentices, who had terrified his children by telling them ghost stories. According to Bell's Weekly Messenger, he expected to check them in this disagreeable bent of their mind to the prejudice of his children by presenting them as they passed homewards a figure of a ghost, which, it seems, he managed very successfully. The magistrate, not certain how to deal with him, released him on bail. A rumour then spread around the district that the ghost was to do public penance that Sunday by being made to stand by St. Paul's Church wrapped in a white sheet. On the day in question, a huge crowd gathered at the church to behold the spectacle of the spectre, but the rumour, it turned out, was untrue, and they waited in vain. Graham was adamant that he had only ever gone out dressed as a ghost on 1 occasion, and as far as I can ascertain, this was accepted, and no further action was taken against him. Which meant that the ghost was still out there, and Graham's apprehension did little to assuage the fears of the residents of Hammersmith. As Bell's Weekly Messenger reported, notwithstanding the discovery and detection, very few will yet venture out after dark, so dreadful has been the impression made on the minds of the inhabitants. But the press coverage and local indignation, as well as the tragedy of the death of Thomas Milwood, appears to have deterred the ghost, and with no more reports of sightings, life slowly returned to normal in the district, and gradually more and more people began to venture out after dark. By 1824, the Hammersmith Ghost was little more than a distant memory for most of the inhabitants of the district. But on Friday the 3rd of December of that year, readers of the Morning Herald opened their newspaper to find the disturbing headline, "A New Hammersmith Ghost." The accompanying article must have chilled the marrows and curdled the breakfast milk of those who could remember the awful events of 20 years previous. There is now a new Hammersmith ghost frightening the neighbourhood, and the trick has been carried on upwards of a month, to the serious injury of many persons. In the different lanes and byroads, a tall figure dressed in white is in the habit of appearing and crossing the paths of females, and then suddenly disappearing. Many persons have been seriously alarmed by this figure, which is rendered of tall and of theatrically appalling stature. During the last week of November, and throughout the first 3 weeks of December, accounts of this new spectre's exploits were detailed in newspapers across the country. At the end of November, the ghost had appeared to a girl working at the Angel public house as she made her way home late one night. She was so terrified by the experience that her life was despaired of by her friends, and she was subject to dangerous fits. A hard-working man was passing along the byroad from the Hammersmith Waterworks, which actually stood adjacent to the Black Lion, when the ghost jumped on his back, threw him to the ground, and then vanished. The man suffered a broken arm as a result of the encounter. On Monday the 20th of December, the ghost attacked a young woman on Turnham Green, brutally tearing her clothes from her person and scratching her face with what seemed to be small hooks. By the end of the month, the ghost was being referred to in the newspapers as the Hammersmith Monster. Not content with frightening women in lampless lanes, the London Courier reported on Thursday the 30th of December, the monster rarely quits the terrified objects who may happen to come in his way without scratching or seriously wounding them. The London Packet and New Lloyd's Evening Post came up with a possible means by which the ghost might be taken in its New Year's Eve edition. It would be no bad plan if 2 or 3 stout young men were to sally forth at night in various directions, dressed in female apparel, so as to catch hold of and make an example of this ghost. The paper also gave details of another attack. He went to a small house kept by a gardener named White, opening the front door by lifting the latch. The wife was there, the front parlour being a species of chandler's shop, and she was not a little affrighted to behold in the doorway a strangely and ghostly dressed figure with a large ugly mask and glaring eyeballs. Some flame was then omitted, after which the ghost exclaimed, "Good night, farewell," and decamped with supernatural rapidity. Reports of appearances and attacks continued throughout January and into early February 1825. Then, on the 15th of February, a Mr. N. Worsley was returning to Fulham from Kensington at 1 o'clock in the morning, when a man on horseback, clothed in a white sheet and what the newspapers described as a hairy cap tied under his chin, came towards him. His arms were extended, and he was making a hideous noise. The fearless Mr. Worsley seized hold of the horse's reins, pulled the sheet off the ghost, and apprehended him. The next day the ghost appeared before local magistrate Mr. Hanson, and was revealed to be a young man by the name of John Benjamin, a farmer and hay salesman from Alperton. Asked by the magistrate why he had done it, he declared that he had only meant it as a joke. The magistrate failed to see the funny side of his antics and ordered him to stand trial at the next quarter sessions. At the Middlesex sessions, a true bill was found against him for unlawfully disguising himself with a view to frightening His Majesty's subjects and with assaulting a man. With that, the sightings of ghostly figures around the remote lanes and byways of Hammersmith petered out, and the people of the district could once again go out at night without fear or trepidation. In 1955, however, Hammersmith enjoyed, or endured, depending on how you view these things, another burst of ghost fever courtesy of the West London Observer. On Friday the 29th of July, the newspaper published a headline that advised readers, "The ghost that haunts Hammersmith may appear on Wednesday." The article added a few extra facts about the original ghost that had not been included in any of the 19th century newspaper reports. "One dark night in 1803, it began, a man cut his throat near the church. It is his ghost that, it is believed, will appear on Wednesday night." The intrepid reporter informed readers that, "This week I spoke to a resident of Hammersmith for over 70 years, who declined to give his name, and he told me that he saw the ghost 50 years ago, wearing a white winding sheet, its eyes flaming. Generations of his family, right back to his great-grandmother, have seen it. His great-grandmother was one of the first to see it when it began to appear between December 1803 and January 1804. She had been walking through the churchyard when a tall white figure rose from the tombs and chased her until she fainted. When she recovered, the ghost had disappeared. 2 days later, she died." The Hammersmith resident's great-grandfather, husband of the woman who died, saw it on an August night in 1805 when the moon was full. Rumour has it that since then the ghost appears every 50 years on an August night when the moon is full. The ghost is, therefore, due to appear on Wednesday night, which will have the first full moon in August, and will be exactly 50 years after its last appearance. The article ended with the tantalizing promise that a WLO reporter will spend Wednesday night in St. Paul's churchyard. Over the next few days, national newspapers picked up on the story, and by the day on which the ghost was due to make its appearance, Wednesday the 3rd of August, the church warden, Mr. C.E.J. Masters, had been inundated with inquiries from would-be ghost hunters. "It's a lot of bunkum," he told the Daily Herald, "but we don't want people trampling the churchyard. If there's something strange in the neighbourhood, who you gonna call? Yes, you've guessed it, the police." On Wednesday, the 3rd of August, the Daily Herald issued a blunt warning to all seekers of the supernatural. If there are any amateur ghost hunters near the churchyard of St. Paul's Church, they'd better watch out, not for ghosts, but for the police. At 9 o'clock tonight, the church gates will be locked, police will be on guard, and the verger, Mr. W. F. Mayers, will prepare for a night's vigil in the vestry. However, warnings to stay away failed to deter the ghost hunters, and that night over 100 people, plus a large contingent of Fleet Street journalists, turned up at the churchyard to find the gates locked and the police poised to repel them should they try to gain entry. Undeterred, the crowd surrounded the churchyard and watched in eager anticipation. "We had all been there since 9:30, the West London Observer's Chris Farman informed readers on the 5th of August, and were prepared for hoaxers. Already more than 10 attempts had been made to jape the crowd, and police had escorted at least 3 of the early ghosts from the churchyard. As midnight approached, the crowd were on tenterhooks. But when the witching hour came and went without the ghost putting in an appearance, the majority of the crowd dispersed. But Chris Farman and 17 other ghost hunters lingered, having figured out that although the clocks showed 12 o'clock, the real time, allowing for British summertime, was of course only 11 o'clock. Therefore, the traditional time for ghosts to appear was not for another hour. So Chris and the 17 other enthusiasts stayed outside the railings, and as the clock struck 1, their perseverance was rewarded when they heard a strange sound like wind rushing through the trees. A strange light fading and then glowing appeared on the church wall, and then a figure draped in brilliant white appeared to waft from the northwest porch of the church and drifted towards a nearby solitary tomb. It had no legs, Chris reported, and seemed to float onto the tomb. It remained there for several seconds, and then appeared to sink into the tomb. And with that, the curtain came down on the Hammersmith Ghost's semi-centennial appearance, and the good people of the district could relax for another 50 years. In 2005, the next time the ghost was due to appear, several newspapers tried to stoke up anticipation for the auspicious occasion, but it didn't catch the public imagination in the way that it had done in 1955, and it will be 2055 before the spectre pays another visit to St. Paul's churchyard. Today, Hammersmith is anything but remote and isolated. Black Lion Lane, where the unfortunate Thomas Milwood was gunned down by Francis Smith, has changed beyond recognition, albeit some sections of it do still possess a rural ambience. The A40 now bisects it, and the fumes from the traffic are perhaps the most disturbing thing that lone wayfarers will encounter here. The White Hart, where Francis Smith approached William Girdler to tell him what he'd done, is now a Sainsbury's local, albeit the current building is a later rebuild of the original. The Black Lion pub is still going strong, and is as a delightful hostelry as you could wish for in which to while away a few pleasant hours. A board on the wall of the beer garden provides a brief account of the Hammersmith Ghost, and it is whispered that Thomas Milwood haunts the place. Walking the byways around here, or to be more precise, the asphalt-covered streets that are lined with gleaming rows of residents' cars, it is difficult to picture it as a rustic and isolated neighbourhood with high hedgerows casting its thoroughfares into almost impenetrable darkness. Thanks to street lighting, night-time is no longer the fright time that it was for those long-ago residents when the hours of darkness were best spent indoors, for fear of whatever malevolent forces might be lurking in the darker recesses should you dare to venture out at night. And, as can be seen from this story, in an age when superstition held far more sway than it does today, it only took an unscrupulous individual, or more probably several individuals, armed with nothing more than a white sheet or a tablecloth, to send an entire district into paroxysms of terror and hysteria. As the Derby Mercury put it, the circumstance of the Hammersmith Ghost, however ridiculous in itself, shows that the minds of ordinary people are still liable to be terrified by phantoms, and that the uncertainties of barbarous ages are not as yet completely exploded.